Many students enter our programs without the background of how to learn, particularly how to learn from failure. Now, our society often views failure as a way in which we have reached our limit. This just isn't true. A true educational process allows learners to identify their weaknesses and learn from their failures. You don't know what you don't know. Learning, or how to learn, is one of those things that many do not know how to do. Now, this video will take evidence-based material, pass it on to you, and allow you to continue your learning process in a more efficient and comprehensive manner. When it comes to learning, many people will just do what they did in the past, regardless of outcome. Then when a poor performance on a quiz or a test comes up, the answer turns to, well, I guess I just need to study a little longer. This then usually turns to, well, I was never taught about this stuff. When you seek advice from others, you may hear something like, look, either you get it or you don't. It's that simple. Now, this has been the mindset of many people. However, if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, it is the definition of insanity. Now, I've also heard this quote as being, if you do the same thing over and over again, it is the definition of stupidity. Regardless, stop the insanity. If we are not finding good results from things that we have been doing in the past, simply studying longer is not going to fix the problem. It is the quality of your studying that you must correct. Now, most of us, including me, were never taught to learn, and we need to get rid of the mindset of either you get it or you don't. And these are a few topics that we're going to discuss today. Now, you've probably had the experience of someone ask if you were an auditory, a kinesthetic, or a visual learner. There is no scientific evidence to support the theory of these learning styles. Now, does this mean that this needs to be dismissed? Well, yes and no. The idea of there being 3 learning styles did allow cognitive scientists, which are those who study how we learn, to use current medical technologies such as PET scanners and high-resolution MRI machines to determine how we process information and then help other scientists to design experiments in determining how we learn, and to that end, what methods will improve our recall of that information. Keep in mind that this is a short video to help you in the learning process. This is not an all-encompassing course on learning. Additionally, there are several concepts presented here separately. One is not better than the other. We have to use these together so that we can maximize everyone's learning and recall. Our first idea is that of mindset. Some people will say, oh wait, this is about a positive attitude. This is not the case. It is a much bigger theory than just being positive. I will tell you, though, that positivity is a factor. To start moving forward today, here is going to be your first activity. Go to any web browser and type in bit.ly/mymindset. Now, once you go there and you complete this brief questionnaire, you will be asked to enter your email address, your first name, your last name, the school you are with. Yes, you should put this one that you are in now. And then the title should either be student, teacher, or instructor. Now, this is going to help you identify what your mindset is. So now pause the video and give it a shot. I also included the link, that bit.ly link, in the description below. After you receive your results in your email, go ahead and continue on with this video. Your results usually indicate that you are towards the growth mindset or the fixed mindset. Now, you notice I said towards. This is because you usually are not totally one mindset versus the other. So here are just a few characteristics of those who have a growth mindset. Did you find some characteristics you may need to develop? I know I sure do. So let's take a look now at some of the fixed mindsets. Now you would notice that I paused to allow you an opportunity to read the slide. Pausing allowed you to read the slides without me talking. Otherwise, you would have been reading the slide while I was still talking about mindsets and missed something. So answer this for me. When you were reading those slides, you were in silence. Whose voice was in your head? That's right, it was yours. This means that you were taking up the visual and auditory channels that are in your brain to provide that input. Now, if those channels become overloaded, you will not be able to store much, if anything, in your memory. So what does this mean to you as a student? Well, first off, when you study, you should be sure that there are limited distractions. Let's take your situation. You choose to come to class to improve yourself. Walking in the door, you do not know everything there is to know to be a certified EMS provider. Because if you did, you would possess the certification that you're seeking. So you are looking to successfully learn to make sure you achieve your goal of completing this class. You already know that you are planning to learn and get smarter. You are in the growth mindset. Now you will need to put forth the time and the effort to achieve your goal. So let's look at some study tips to improve our learning process. I mentioned earlier about the growth mindset. This again is just one ingredient in the learning recipe. So let's find out a little bit more about that.
Researcher and professor Carol Dweck uses the term mindset to describe the way people think about ability and talent. Dweck delineates between two different mindsets that exist on a continuum. The first is the fixed mindset, which suggests that your abilities are innate and unchangeable. The second is a growth mindset, which views it as something you can improve through practice. In a fixed mindset, you view failure as permanent, but with a growth mindset, you see failure as a chance to learn and even pivot. Those with a fixed mindset are more likely to view critical feedback as a personal attack, while those with a growth mindset will see it as a chance to improve, where they can develop new systems. With a fixed mindset, you're more likely to choose easier tasks and put in minimal effort. After all, if talent is fixed, why bother improving? Why even try? But with a growth mindset, you're more likely to embrace challenging tasks and work hard to improve. Those with a fixed mindset are likely to give up when they face an obstacle. Meanwhile, those with a growth mindset will view obstacles as a chance to experiment and solve problems. In a fixed mindset, the focus is on measurable accomplishments. But with a growth mindset, the focus is more on a journey of continual improvement. With a fixed mindset, you're less likely to take creative risks. But with a growth mindset, creative risks are simply a way to innovate and improve. Ultimately, your mindset influences everything from creative risk-taking to how you view feedback to whether or not you finish difficult tasks. And in the end, it's one of the greatest factors in determining whether or not you grow and improve in your abilities.
Now, I've witnessed students who come into the classroom. They're scared to death of quizzes and tests. I was one of them. They have already convinced themselves that they will fail because they are not good at something. Many are afraid to even say anything in a classroom for fear of being wrong or sounding stupid. Now, this is an example of a fixed mindset. Unfortunately, many have never had someone sit down and explain that it is okay to mess up as long as they learn from those mistakes. You are with us to learn. As the instructor and administrator of this course, I will tell you I will make mistakes during your course. My goal, though, is to reduce those errors and keep them at a minimum. An instructor or a teacher is not the keeper of all knowledge on a particular subject. They mess up too. Therefore, you will notice in the schedule that I often use the term facilitator instead of instructor. Why? Well, we are facilitating the learning. We are learning too. Not convinced that learning takes efforts? If you play a game on your phone or on a gaming console, how long did it take you to, say, reach level 5? If you reach level 5 quickly, you immediately think there are hundreds of levels because of how easy you made it to that level. You may then stop playing the game because, quite frankly, there was no challenge. Now, on the other hand, if it took you a while, it was a challenge, and you most likely embraced the challenge of learning how to beat the game. Let's look at some memory tips and evidence-based strategies.
Since we know that remembering information is one of the foundations of critical thinking, it's worthwhile to consider how we can improve our memories, and note that it can be improved. For example, learning mnemonics or memory techniques is what enables memory experts like Joshua 4 to memorize the order of cards in a shuffled deck in only 30 seconds. But remember, it takes practice to improve your memory. In this video, we'll share with you a few examples of how you can boost your memory. Note that many involve elaboration, processes which deepen your encoding, that is, digesting of information. To boost your memory, think deeply about a concept and then explain it in your own words in your own way. Consider how the new concept connects with concepts you already know. New information is easier to remember if it can stick to or hook up with information already in your brain. So, if you can prime yourself for new material by thinking about similar content, you'll remember more of the new information. A few ways in which you can do this is to create a concept map, an outline, or a sequence of steps depending on the type of information to be learned. Consider how the concept relates to you personally. This boosts our memory because our brains are designed to pay more attention to things which are relevant to us. Other mnemonics include grouping items together by meaning. For example, when students learn to read music, one of the phrases they memorize is "every good boy deserves fudge." This phrase helps students to remember what note each line on a music staff denotes. Encode information through as many sensory systems as well as motor system as is possible. In other words, learn your concepts by experiencing them whenever possible. Instead of learning about a strawberry from reading a textbook, you would have a deeper understanding of a strawberry if you were also able to feel, smell, and taste one. Learning about a concept in this way also multiplies the retrieval cues you could use to recall the information. And in the case of vision, you'd also be taking advantage of one of the most powerful systems in our brains. Here are some examples of how you could use the visual system to boost memory. Associate vivid and unusual pictures with concepts. For example, if trying to remember what the idiom couch potato means, you could picture a fat potato sitting lazily on a couch, using a remote control to flip through TV channels. Metaphors, particularly those combined with visual cues, are also a great elaboration tool. For example, when Forrest Gump said, "Life was like a box of chocolates," if you could see him sitting on the bench, telling the woman about all the twists and turns of his life while eating a variety of chocolates, you'd have a deeper understanding of what life means. The memory palace is also a popular mnemonic. Say that you have a list of groceries you need to buy at the store. Start by visualizing a house with a fair number of rooms. Then imagine going through the house and mentally dropping each of your items into a room. This is particularly effective if you can visualize something unusual. Perhaps you imagine walking into the living room and seeing the apple and orange making out with each other. Once you're at the grocery store, you can go through each room to remember each item. Likely, you won't forget the apples and oranges. Above all, don't forget that one of the most effective ways to remember information is to practice remembering it. Practice retrieving information from long-term memory and in a distributed manner. If you are learning new information, you want to wait long enough so that some forgetting occurs, such that it takes effort to recall the information. But don't wait so long that the memory trace completely disappears. The better you know something, the greater the amount of time there should be in between practice sessions. We've covered just a few memory tips. There are many more, and you can learn about them by going to the Learning Center, taking the Science of Learning course offered by the School of Education, and by reading the books listed in the relevant and recommended resources at the end of this video. There are also numerous internet sites which describe mnemonics, and you can find them by simply Googling mnemonics. Unlike rereading, which has been found to be one of the least effective study strategies, the following methods may seem slow in producing learning gains, but in actuality, researchers have identified these to be the most effective and most time-efficient study strategies. They are: practice retrieval of long-term memories, space out your practices, and interleave your practices using varied problems. Let's first consider retrieval practice, in other words, testing yourself on the material. You can use the testing strategies already mentioned in the Preparing for an Exam video, and you can also do the following. Create your own test questions, being sure to make questions which will require you to use different levels of thinking as according to Bloom's revised taxonomy of cognition. Even better, create a Google document with peers where others can contribute questions. Have everyone answer the questions on their own, and then meet to discuss which answers are the best, and most importantly, why. Use flashcards, whether ones you've created or ones that have already been created online, such as on ankisrs.net or Quizlet.com. If you don't know the answer, pause and try to generate one instead of quickly reading the answer. This pausing and thinking will pay off later. Additionally, when testing yourself, don't forget to check your answers so that you have feedback about whether or not your answers are the best ones. You can, of course, use your notes, but another great way of getting feedback is to compare your answers with that of other students. I cannot emphasize enough how important testing is when learning. Now let's consider spacing out your practices, otherwise known as distributed practice. If you don't space out your practices, you'll give rise to an illusion of confidence where you think you are retrieving information from long-term memory when in fact there's a great chance that you are actually retrieving it from short-term memory. If you don't space out your practices, you may think you know something, but really, you know it only temporarily because it's fresh on your mind. The goal, however, is not only to know something for an exam, but to know it for the long term. This is the reason that instructors often warn students against cramming, also known as mass practice. Exactly how should you space out your practices of retrieval? Long enough that it's a bit effortful to remember the information, but not so long that you completely forget the information, resulting in having to relearn it. Many experts suggest spacing practices apart about a day for newly learned information, and then longer for information you know fairly well. In other words, the better you know something, the greater the amount of time you should have in between practices. Now let's discuss interleaving using varied problems. This study strategy entails alternating what you study instead of studying one thing at a time. For example, instead of studying the anatomy and function of a neuron thoroughly before moving on to learn about the various types of brain chemicals, alternate between the two topics. Perhaps study the neuron for 30 minutes, and then study brain chemicals for the next 30 minutes, and then repeat. You should also interleave by using varied problems. For example, if your goal is to learn the different painting styles of artists, instead of first learning all of Picasso's works before moving on to study all of Van Gogh's works and then next Da Vinci's works, mix it up. Study some of Picasso's, then look at a few of Van Gogh's, and then some of Da Vinci's. Then mix up the order and study their works again, but this time, use different paintings. Doing so will not only acquaint you with each artist's style, but it will also help you to better discriminate between them. In this way, you really deepen your knowledge of artistic styles. Notice, by the way, that interleaving is a natural way of spacing out your practices. For more information about study strategies, including additional tips as well as the research and logic underlying the tips, check out the relevant and recommended resources at the end of this video. You may also want to consider taking the Science of Learning course offered by the School of Education, or talk with an academic coach at the Learning Center to help integrate these tips into your study practice.
We will revisit some of these in a little bit. For now, we are going to put a 5-step plan in place for studying. Now, schedules become dynamic in a course. The best laid plans must allow for some flexibility in movement. Now, your class schedule, of course, is the same way. So when changes occur, make sure that the instructor or facilitator alerts you of these. First, prior to class, look through the chapter. Look at the objectives. These objectives are truly where the test questions come from. Read the introduction, then skim through the chapter and look at the bolded words. Write down the word and then the definition. Check out the charts, look at the pictures. Look at each heading in the chapter. Finally, when you get to the end of the chapter, read the summary. You are now primed for the information you are about to learn. This is the same thing that a trailer for an upcoming movie does. It gains your interest. So what is it in the chapter that interests you? What questions are you forming in your mind? Hey, write them down. Second, go to class. Just because you show up does not mean that you are going to sit there like a sponge and absorb all the information covered in the class. You need to be an active participant. This means ask questions, pay attention, volunteer to demonstrate a skill, and make sure that you take notes. The more boring the class, the more notes you should take. Now, as an adult learner, you are responsible for your own education. So therefore, you must participate. Third, review your notes after class. Make sure you reorganize them. Find out if you missed something. Fill in the blanks. Write down any questions you may have after reviewing and reorganizing your notes. Bring them to the class. Fourth, you should plan for several study sessions a day. Now, these should be short sessions, but caution though, do not reread. You have already read through it. Rereading the material will waste your time and has been proven to be very ineffective learning technique. Yes, there are tips coming up on what to do. Fifth, assess your understanding of the material. Use testing resources. Make up your own test questions. Create questions for others in the class to take and exchange them back and forth. Use flashcards, which provide application or problem-solving material, not just rote knowledge of definitions. Remember, your study sessions need to occur each day. Each session should be between 30 minutes to an hour. Establish what it is that you want to achieve. Plan these sessions as part of your day. Heck, put them into your schedule. You should also have what I call emergency material available. This means that if you're sitting in a waiting room, you're in a checkout line, you're waiting in traffic when there is traffic backup, take advantage of that downtime. So when opportunities arise, you review something, you study. Use the resources that you have available. So now we have a plan for studying. Our first stop is reading. While we were taught how to read, we most likely were not taught how to be an active reader. This means you need to interact with the static material. Doing so will make you a more effective reader. So let's hear some ways in which we can interact with our reading.
Hey, what's up? It's Thomas Frank, and in this video, we're talking about active reading. So active reading is a method of reading a book with the intent of pulling something useful out of it. And it's different from just passively going over the text once just to experience it. So right off the bat, I'm going to say there are a lot of systems that have been put forward, like SQ3R, SQ4R, and lots of other acronym-driven systems for active reading. And I think that these systems are too cumbersome, they take too long, and I'm not going to be going over them in this video. And I'm not the only one who thinks this. So instead, what I'm going to do is show you how I'm applying active reading to 3 specific books that I've been reading recently and how I'm able to recall the information better by doing that. But first, I'm going to give you 5 general active reading tips that you can apply to any reading that you have to do. So the first tip is to use a technique called PseudoSkimming. And the longer the readings that you have to do are, the more likely a lot of the paragraphs in those readings are going to be filler. That could be like background, it could be extra detail, it could be asides, things like that. And often you don't really need to read these paragraphs all that in depth to get the information you need for your classes. So the pseudo-skimming technique is really a paragraph by paragraph technique where you skim each paragraph very quickly, and then you sort of get a feel for the reading and figure out which paragraphs hold the most important information. The second tip is to try to read backwards. A lot of textbooks are not all that exciting. They don't really have a narrative, and you're not going to spoil yourself if you read it backwards or go to the end. So if you want to figure out what a certain chapter is all about, you can first go to the back, look at the summary, look at the vocab lists that are put back there, some of the questions, the review items, and get a feel for what the actual chapter wants you to learn in a big sense, in like a sky-high sense. And once you get that, you can start going backwards and seeing like, okay, yes, this vocabulary word was mentioned here. This graphic mentions a topic that was in a review question, etc., etc. Tip number 3 is to come up with questions while you read. So when you are going through the chapter, if you're doing pseudo-skimming or anything else, when something comes up that you don't really know about, then note that down as a question. And you can also use the headings, the subheadings in the chapter as questions. So if there's a subheading that talks about a specific concept, you can reword that as a question, maybe even write it down in your notes, and then as you go through the actual content of that section, answer the question for yourself. And you can do this in review as well. Tip number 4 is to pay attention to the formatting of the text. Now, when I was in college, I would do this with almost all of my readings. I would open up the book, I would look at almost every single bolded item or list of things, and I would pay special attention to those items in the text because they probably were to go over processes that are important to the chapter or go over vocab terms that are almost certainly going to appear on tests. So pay attention to things that stand out in their formatting and note those down. And my last tip before I actually get into some of the books I'm reading is to either mark up the book while you're reading or to take notes while you're reading. So if you own the book, you can actually write in it with a pencil and make notes in the margins, which is really helpful. And if you don't, you can use flags or possibly highlight depending on your school's policies. And I'll show you that in a bit. If you really don't want to mark up your book, then you can take like really short bulleted notes on a piece of paper. You can also put questions in there, or you can take flow style notes. And I'll actually throw some of my recent notes up on the screen here. So these are notes that I took in researching textbook reading strategies for these videos, and this one and the last one. And as you can see, I took notes on the things I was reading, actually for multiple books, but it ended up creating a better picture that I could come back to. And it's in my own words, it's in my own terms, so it makes for better recall. So those are my 5 tips, and to round this video out, I'm going to show you a few of the books that I've been reading and 3 different active reading strategies that I adopted for each book. And the first book is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Now this book is about cognitive biases, it's about bugs in human reasoning and rationality and decision making, and it's a super dense book. I actually have only gotten to page 145, as my little nine tails will tell you. If you look at the spine, or not the spine here, but the side of it, I've used flags to mark up almost every page that I have read. So this is one of those books that's just packed with information on almost every single page. Every single chapter mentions multiple studies with lots of results, defines different terms, and I was really interested in almost everything I was reading here. So as I went through, I used flags to mark up the book in a non-damaging way. And I was reading this book about a year ago. I've become a little bit more okay with marking up my books permanently since then, but the flag method does work, especially if you're renting textbooks or you plan on selling it later. You can just pull them out when you need to, when you have good notes for them and you've finished reviewing. But yeah, it's a pretty good method. So the second book here is Confessions of a Scholarship Winner by Christina Ellis, and I'm going through this book because it's a fantastic overview of how to win scholarships. I'm probably going to put it on my essential books list and create a lot of blog posts and things on it. But with this book, I actually went through with a pencil and I would bracket paragraphs that held specific ideas I wanted to review later. I would write notes in the margin, underline specific terms that are actually really important. And as I'm looking back through the book, I can see all the spots that I wanted to note for later. So I'm actually going to go through the book a second time once I finish reading it and take good notes on it. And speaking of notes, the book I've been reading most recently is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And if you were to be able to look through this book, you'll see no markings whatsoever. So I actually have a third active reading system, which is working really, really well for me at this point. And it's just to take notes on the chapter after I've read it. So I've created a habit of reading this Power of Habit. I've created a habit of reading this book every single day for at least 15 minutes. And I check it off in Habit RPG. And it's something that's becoming a very strong habit for me. So I definitely do it every day. And about once every 2 days, I finish a chapter. And immediately when I finish reading a chapter, I'll go over to Evernote on my desktop computer, go back through the chapter and write notes in Evernote, which you can see right now on the chapter. So I've actually got a good bulleted summary of almost the entire book right now. Everything that I thought was important in the book is in that summary, and it's going to be about 3,000 words once I finish it, I'm estimating. So that's a lot less than what's in the book. And if I want to go back and review what I learned, it's going to be much easier. And it's in my own words as well. So those are just some of the strategies you can use for active reading. Hopefully you can implement some of these into your studies in order to cut down on that study time and increase your recall and your ability to do better on tests and essays and whatever it is you need to apply your readings to. If you want to get more videos on being an awesome student, then just hit that subscribe button below. Otherwise, I will see you in next week's video.
Here are some additional tips for annotation. Annotation, or annotate, means to take notes. You are putting things in your own words. This helps you comprehend and review information later. Now be aware that this does take time and practice, so don't give up. Highlighting something in a textbook is doing nothing more than highlighting the author's words. It's stuff that they comprehend. Make sure that you bring your words out and you summarize it. You paraphrase what is going on. It allows more comprehension for you. Circle words that you may not know. Make sure that you then look them up. Question marks should be placed in areas that you're confused or uncertain about. Then make sure that you ask these things in class. Maybe star something that you feel is important, something you want to come back to. Write notes, either in the margins, on sticky notes, or even use a separate notebook. English literature indicates that really we should be paraphrasing an entire chapter. Now, it would make sense for me to paraphrase each paragraph or section of your book. Just write down the questions you need to answer. This could be something linked to prior learning or something which you feel needs addressed in a class or with other students. You may be a color coding person where you may circle some things in a color, or you put a sticky note that's a different color. Whatever you do for a color code, make sure that you place a color code chart in your book so that you remember what you're doing. Well, what about taking notes? Here's a great method on taking some notes in class.
The Cornell method is a way of taking notes. A professor at Cornell University created this system to help his students keep their notes organized and useful. Here's the technique. On a sheet of lined notepaper, draw a horizontal line above the bottom 6 lines of the paper. Then draw a vertical line from the top margin down to this horizontal line, about 1/3 of the way from the left edge. Put today's date at the top of the sheet. Take down your notes in the large note-taking right column. Your notes should consist of the main ideas of the lecture, video, or textbook you are studying. Keep your notes efficient. Paraphrase longer ideas. No need for complete sentences here. Use phrases that leave out parts of speech such as articles, conjunctions, prepositions, and auxiliaries. Think about how people write Twitter posts or news headlines. Use symbols and abbreviations where possible. Include quick sketches of the material when appropriate. In the left Q column, jot down relevant questions and keywords. Do this during your note-taking or immediately after. Writing questions and prompts helps you clarify meanings, reveal relationships, and establish continuity. This Q column will also assist you with your future reviews of the material. Within 24 hours of taking notes, write a brief summary in the bottom 6 lines of each page. Condensing your notes down to a couple of sentences helps you make the topic more clear in your mind. When you are studying for a test or quiz, you now have a concise yet detailed record of your previous classes. A method of review is to cover the note-taking column and look only at the left-hand column. Say aloud, in your own words, the answers to the questions and prompts indicated. Spend at least 10 minutes every week reviewing all your previous notes. Regular review of your notes between tests helps you better comprehend new lectures. It also enhances your long-term recall of the material. Try it and see for yourself how helpful this method can be.
As mentioned earlier, mind mapping is a graphic representation of linked concepts and ideas. And creating a mind map is a great way to almost perform a brain dump of what it is that you know about a specific concept. And then from that main concept, you start linking things with branches, and then there's twigs. And, sometimes you may find more information on this, and they call it a parent and a child. But, let's take a look at an example of something that I have done in a class. So here is a complaint of shortness of breath. So coming from that main idea, you will see that there are several branches which represent the body systems which may have a complaint of shortness of breath or have a disease process that causes shortness of breath. Then each twig has a specific disease. Now, a map like this helps you link the knowledge of a complaint to a disease process. This then demonstrates a thorough understanding of the material. You have to keep breaking it down and asking why, or how. You'll always look for the who, what, where, when, and why, and of course the how. You may use this as a way to assess your knowledge, or maybe a way in which you can organize some study material. For retrieval practice, I'm going to bring in a video that I created talking about retrieval practice, and I think it will provide you with some great insight into adopting some retrieval practices. As an adult learner, one of the things that I always figured out was that when I have to study for something, it was always, hey, let me go reread the book. Let me reread my texts. Let me reread all of the notes that I have taken from the class so that I can be better prepared for a test. And what I have found is that in our education literature, rereading is actually one of the worst things that we can do. And particularly if we reread anything with massive amount of input. That seems to be our problem. We put a lot of things into our brain, but we don't practice on trying to get that information back out, of course, until it's time for a test. So we're going to learn a little bit about some retrieval practices. And one of the things that I am going to show you is currently a program that is available online called Quizlet is one aspect. There's another one that I'm going to give you an example of which you can do on paper, but also has an equivalent part to it called Anki Web, A-N-K-I Web. And those are some flashcard programs that you can use to help start that retrieval practice. And we'll take a look at what we're talking about here. So because I am from medicine EMS, we're going to use some examples here that are based off of those areas. Well, let's give an example here. You have a question in Quizlet that is saying, hey, here's the prompt. This is on the front of the card. It says, when performing compressions on a 67-year-old female, at what depth should you compress the chest? And when you are thinking to yourself, oh, I think I remember this, and it is 2 to 2.4 inches. So I'm asked to type in this information. Now, once I type it in, it's great to go. This is a simple knowledge question, but it is just a step above our typical regurgitation of information for knowledge because I'm making myself, as the student, think about, oh, it's a 67-year-old. That means that it's an adult, and it's not a 6-year-old, which now means that I have a different depth of compression. So it's not just simply putting one object on the card and say, what's the depth of compression for an adult? I'm now asking that a little bit more, asking myself as a student, do I recognize that this is an adult? Because now that's how I would be doing CPR on somebody in the real world. I would not say, oh, excuse me, are you an adult? That's not what I would ask. I would have to assess them to determine whether or not they were an adult. Let's take a look at another question. So another question I may put on my card could be, during a cardiac arrest, what is the dosage of epinephrine? Pretty straightforward. I'm pulling one specific area out of a medication and asking what the dosage is. So I type in 1 milligram. And if I type it in and all of a sudden I realize, you know what? I did not put it in there correctly. And if I didn't put it in there correctly, it may have been a typo. It may have been something else like, I put a decimal point in there where it said 1.0 milligrams. Probably not a problem, and that's why there is this nice little thing over here that says override I was correct, because they're not flawless. But the problem is that sometimes we give ourselves a false sense of security, and meaning that we think that we learned all this information when in reality we probably didn't, and we override it. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So let's take a flashcard, and on the one side of the flashcard, I put aspirin. Now, I flip that flashcard over, if it's paper, and I'm going to write some other things on here. If it is in something like a digital format, like AnkiWeb or Quizlet, as you see here, I can put more information on here the same way. Makes no difference. So I'm going to put my indications of the medications, my contraindications, my side effects, my dosages. So I put all those things on the other side of the card. When I do so, I then shuffle up all my other cards, and I pull up and I see, aspirin. So I recite my indications, my contraindications, and when I get to the dosages, I get it and I put it in there correctly, but I may not do the whole entire range correctly, and I forgot a couple side effects that may occur. So when I flip that card over, I've noticed that, and I go, you know what, I'm okay. It's the same thing as overriding. And now we have this false sense of security because you didn't get it 100% correct. What you can do, put my flashcards in a pile. And this day, I'm going to really assess what's going on. By the way, I can do this with the electronic versions as well. So I pull up aspirin. I now have a piece of paper that is beside me, and I write down everything that I'm aware that I should know about aspirin. And when I'm done, I flip the card over, and I now compare the answers that I placed on the flashcard earlier to the answers that I have now just written in my paper. And I am now giving myself a grade, A, B, C, D, or F. And failing is not a problem as long as you recognize where your problems are at, right? You can learn from it. Well, the reason that you are grading them is you put them into different piles, and those that have the lower grades, such as a C or D or an F, are the ones that you're going to have to make as a higher priority. Those that are A and B, still going to have to review, but they're not going to need to be reviewed as often. And we'll learn about ways in which we can interleave some of these things a little bit later on. What will end up happening is that you'll get better with remembering this information. Now, that's not the way that we're always going to work it into the real world. Another time, you're going to sit down and you're going to take a look at that flashcard, and it says aspirin. And I'm going to say, oh, I remember that I can give this to people that are experiencing chest pain. But I'm going to run a scenario through my head, and I'm going to make it so that I test myself on indications, contraindications, side effects, and I'm running this through where I say, sir, do you have any allergies to medications? And he says, yes, I am allergic to acetylsalicylic acid. And I realize that, that's aspirin. And when he says that, I'm going to say, okay, well, what happens when you experience that? And he tells me that he has hives. So now I do see that it's a true allergic reaction. And I just let that scenario continue to go down a pathway that's in my mind. What if? And essentially what you're doing is you're retrieving a lot of this information. You're making it more useful to the things that you are actually learning in class. It's not about the grade. It's about what you're learning. You are learning this information, yes, for a test, but you are learning this information for your success in life and in your career. When it comes to studying, you will need to establish priorities in your life for the duration of this course. Now, you got to keep in mind that there are many ways to prioritize. One way I found was in a Ken Blanchard book called The On-Time, On-Target Manager. In here, he provides an example of how you can break down your day by placing these ideas or these priorities into different categories. And it makes you reflect on the task that you have at hand, and then you place it into these categories. So you look at the things that we want to do and have to do. The things we have to do but don't want to do. The things that we want to do but don't have to do. And of course, then the things that we don't want to do and don't have to do. So every day you need to break this down to help you identify what your priorities are in regards to time management for studying. Staying productive means that you need to assure that you live in a sweet environment. You know, your brain takes up 3% of your body, but it accounts for 20% of its total energy, so you have to take care of it. This means you need to have adequate sleep, And studies show that when you rest, your brain begins organizing the learning into long-term memory. Thus, it is going to aid in the retrieval of this information. Basically, it knows where it's at. You need to stay hydrated. Drinking water, maintaining a good hydration status will improve the way you feel and allow your body to function at an optimal level. You need to exercise throughout the week, whether it is just nice walks, going to the gym for 30 minutes to an hour, whatever it is. This helps with stress and allows you to organize your thoughts. You need to eat healthy. Planning your meals saves money and helps you to eat healthier than a spur of the moment, hey, let's stop here at a fast food restaurant for food. And pretty soon you find that this happens every day. Finally, time. You need to have time put in, not only for studying, but also for socializing. You do need downtime. Yes, downtime is part of learning. So you need to be sure that you remember your friends and your family as you progress through this course. All right, so let's recap. We've identified our mindset and know that we should embrace our failures and mistakes and learn from them. We found out how to use mnemonics and connecting it with previous material. We also know that the more senses that you are using when you learn, the more likely you are to recall it. Maybe this is why we have labs, clinical, and field rotations. We learned about spacing out the material, not cramming things into one study session. We also discussed retrieval practice and why it's important to make sure that you test yourself. We identified how a study session should be planned, and how a study session that has a structure to it is going to be more likely to be successful. And we also looked at several examples on active reading. Okay, so the big day has come. It is time for an exam or a quiz. What should we do? First is to calm down. If you have followed these tips and really put forth the effort, you should do great. As an item writer, I want to share with you some tips to help you with the quiz or exam. So what I've done is taken the checklists that we use as item writers and turned it around to help you with some tips as a test taker. Oftentimes, we find that students that are entering programs like ours have not been asked to problem solve or critically think before. The exams and quizzes are assessing your knowledge, so when you are caring for a patient, it is in a very similar situation in which you can apply that information you now need to know for newer situations in the future. Trivial type information is expected on some quizzes, but usually this is stuff that is left out of high-stakes exam. So if you spend more time trying to remember the definition of things, it may only help you read the question. You have to have a thorough understanding of what is going on with the disease process, of what's going on with the treatment process as well. Test writers will make sure that there is independent content in each question. They are there to assess one thing per one question. They're not going to ask you to assess 5 different things and come up with one answer. Answers that are in the question, or actually in the options, are those that were found by a subject matter expert in at least 2 available resources. And typically, these have also been validated by a total of 3 subject matter experts as being the correct answer. Everybody always talks about trick questions. It takes too long to develop a question to begin with, let alone creating a trick question. So you are not going to find trick questions in those high-stakes exams. The vocabulary used in your questions will be the vocabulary that is expected of somebody who is in the field. So medical terminology is fair game. Otherwise, we usually use plain everyday language. Tests will assess important content that has been deemed important by the curriculum or the education standard as well as the field. So, as an example, the National Registry of Emergency Medical Technicians conducts a practice analysis every 5 years. They assess to determine what is happening in the field of EMS. Through their survey and through their studies, they then compare it to what is actually being logged in our National EMS Information System. From there, it is compared to the education standards. It is then brought forward to make sure that we can assess these areas that are deemed important by our own field. The stem of a question is going to be lean, which means that we get rid of any extra material. We've determined that this is not a reading test. We're here to assess the information that you have gained in this course. So therefore, it is going to be straight and to the point. The less words, the better. When you read the stem of the question, it should be possible to answer the question without ever looking at the choices. Now, there are some exceptions to those rules, but for the most part, when you read the stem of the question, you should have a clear idea of what the problem is. Negative words found in the stem will stand out to you. They will either be capitalized, they will be bolded, they will be both. And not only that, we try to avoid negative words. At the end of a stem, when asked what should you do or what should you suspect, it is implied that the word should be in there also is either first or what should you do next. Unless it's otherwise stated, there is only one right answer. The others are plausible answers. They're not there to trick you, but they are plausible answers. While you're looking at the answers or the options that are there, our high-stakes exam will not have none of the above and will have all are correct. They do not exist. They're not measuring anything. Also, the length of the distractors will be just about equal. One's not going to be longer than the other, and one's not going to be shorter than the other. They're all going to look the same. You will find that there are a minimum of 3 distractors that are used in all of the multiple choice questions. Most of the time, there are 4. However, there are times when 3 work just as well as 4, which usually by that rule means that when the subject matter experts were looking at something like this, they couldn't find a great 4th distractor. Speaking of distractors, a lot of times, typical student errors should be expected to appear as a distractor. So if it's a math problem, the quote stupid math errors that we make will also be there. So expect to see some of those typical errors that you may have. Finally, the test questions that we are utilizing in our certification and final exams are based into 3 areas of Bloom's taxonomy: knowledge, application, or problem solving. Knowledge is a lot of times the information that you may find on one page of a book. The application is taking some of that information and putting it into that chapter and making a decision as to how you should gather that information, assess what is truly going on compared to the other things in that chapter, and then treat them. Problem solving means that I am taking multiple sections of the book and I am now blending it together to critically think of how to solve a problem. The more application and problem solving areas that you work in, the more clinical, the more field time that you do, you will do a better job at answering the application and the problem solving areas. Remember that at the end of the day, a test question was designed to assess those 3 areas. The setting of life is often found at the application and problem solving area. So this is also the area where people feel most challenged. Now, at this point, you should have recognized that you should accept the challenge and really push yourself. Have fun learning. This is a time to build your foundational knowledge. Without it, you will never be able to build your future.